He thought the blizzard was just another lonely night, until he found her, half buried in the snow, bleeding, whispering a single name: Matteo. A stolen child, a mother who refused to stop fighting, and a man who hadn't saved anyone since the day he buried his own son. But that night, as the wind howled across Timber Creek, he made a promise. No more children would be lost, not if he had breath left to fight. If you believe love can pull us back from the edge, stay with us. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Range like a living thing, howling, clawing, snapping branches from the old pines. Snow flew sideways in glassy sheets, turning the land to a blind white. It was the kind of night that swallowed sounds, that erased the world beyond the glow of a lantern. A man could stand in his own yard and forget where he was. A man could feel the past breathing on his neck. Silas McCallum stood in the doorway of his ranch house, one hand on the post, the other braced against the rough timber frame as if the storm itself might carry him away. He was 40, though he looked older in the brittle light. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, threaded with gray, his face creased in ways that did not come from age alone. Grief had carved him deeper than time. 5 winters had passed since the fever came for his wife and infant son. 5 winters he had labored from first light until nightfall, building fences, driving cattle, patching roofs, believing if he kept his hands busy enough, his heart might forget. But memory was a patient predator. It waited in the quiet, in the snow, in the hush between breaths. And on nights like this, when the wind screamed through the eaves and the shadows stretched long across the floorboards, he still reached for voices that would never answer. He should have been inside by the fire, nursing a cup of coffee grown bitter on the stove. He should have shut the door and left the storm to rage. But something pulled at him, some unshakable instinct that the darkness held more than drifting snow. He shifted his lantern higher, scanning the white, his breath rising in clouds. Past the split-rail fence, the yard blurred into nothing. Then he heard it, a sound so small it might have been the creak of old wood or the complaint of ice, except it came again. A ragged, human cry. He felt his chest tighten. For a heartbeat, he thought he was hearing his wife's voice, some trick of loneliness conjured by the blizzard. But the cry came again, nearer this time, thin as thread. He stepped off the porch, boots breaking through the drift, cold swallowing his legs to the knee. The lantern swung in his grip, casting yellow circles over the snow. 50 paces beyond the fence, he saw her, a shape huddled against a fallen log, nearly swallowed by the drift. Dark hair matted with frost. Her dress was torn. Blood, black in the lantern glow, marked the pale fabric. One arm clutched something close to her chest, but as he knelt beside her, he saw her hands were empty. She had been holding on to memory alone. She tried to speak. Her lips were blue, her eyes glassy and wide with a terror that seemed older than the storm. He bent close, his voice low, careful, the way he used to soothe frightened calves. Easy. You're safe now. But her gaze slid past him, searching the dark. Her cracked whisper reached him over the shriek of the wind. They took him. Her voice was raw, splintered. My baby Matteo. Silas swallowed hard. He pressed his hand over hers, feeling how thin the bones were, how little warmth remained. He did not know her name yet, but he knew this kind of loss. The way it hollowed you out, the way it turned your own heartbeat into a curse. He pulled her carefully from the snow, lifting her into his arms as she went limp against his shoulder. The lantern swung, sending shadows over the drifts and the black skeletons of trees. Overhead, the sky churned, a ceiling of white fury. He turned toward the house, boots sinking deep, and felt the first true purpose he had known in years ignite in his chest. This woman had come to his land with a story written in blood and frost, and if God had left any mercy in the world, he would not let her child vanish into that same darkness. The door swung open with a moan of old hinges, spilling warm lamplight onto the porch. Silas kicked it shut behind him. The storm shut out in an instant, leaving only the roar of his own pulse. He carried her to the long wooden bench near the stove and laid her down gently. For a moment, he just stood over her, feeling the tremor in his hands. He had not touched another soul in months, had not let any life so close to his own. She was weightless as driftwood. Her hair spread over the bench in tangled waves, dark as midnight against the rough wool blanket. He could see the outline of each rib where her bodice hung loose, as though her body had been fading long before this night. He knelt and unfastened the sodden cloak from her shoulders. She flinched at the contact, eyes fluttering open, unseeing. He spoke softly, a rumble low in his chest. "You're safe. No one can reach you here." But she didn't answer. Her breath came ragged, each exhale a whimper. The stove popped and hissed, throwing a pulse of orange across the room, catching on the beads of melting ice that clung to her lashes. She looked as though she'd been carved out of the storm itself, made of snow and sorrow. He gathered fresh logs and fed the stove until the heat roared steady, driving the cold from the walls. Then he found the tin basin and filled it with warm water from the kettle. His hands worked without thought, years of tending the sick etched into every movement. He washed the blood from her temple, the cuts along her wrists, the bruises that ringed her arms like shackles. Each mark told a story he did not yet know, a story of wagons in the dark, of gun barrels and iron hands, and a child wrenched screaming from her grasp. When he lifted her hand to clean the raw scrape across her palm, her fingers tightened weakly around his. He met her gaze, and in that instant, the emptiness in her eyes met the emptiness in his, two voids recognizing each other. She tried to speak. Her voice caught, but she forced the words out as if they were the last she would ever spend. "Matteo, please, they'll take him across the border." Her accent was soft and lilting, somewhere from the southern territories, but cracked now with desperation. "Don't let him die out there." He swallowed, his throat dry. He thought of the tiny grave on the hill behind the house, where the snow always drifted deepest, of the nights he'd stood there, hat in hand, telling the wind he was sorry he hadn't done more. He thought he'd buried all the pieces of himself that could care for anyone. But this woman's plea found whatever was left, and it lit to flame. "I won't," he said, voice steady even as his heart shuddered. "I swear to you, he will not be left behind." Her grip slackened, her eyes closing as though she'd spent the last of her strength on that small, tattered hope. He eased her hand down and covered her with a wool quilt, tucking it around her shoulders. For a long while he just watched the rise and fall of her breath, slow and shallow. He realized he didn't even know her name. She was a stranger. But in the hush between the stove's crackle and the storm's howl, he felt an understanding pass between them, an unspoken bond sealed by grief and the hunger to save what was left. He rose and went to the cabinet where he kept the old ledger, flipping to a blank page. By lantern light he scrawled a single line in his rough hand. Isabella Vasquez. He did not know if that was her name, but in his mind he called her that. Isabella because it felt strong, something unbreakable, a name to carry her through the dark. He set the pencil down and looked once more to the bench, where she lay curled around her pain. Then he reached for his coat and rifle. The men who had taken her child would not expect a widower to follow. They would not expect anyone to care enough to come. But before this night was over, they would learn what it meant to steal from a man who had nothing left to lose. The snow was waist-deep in places, filling the ruts of the wagon road until even the fence posts seemed to float in a white sea. Silas lowered his head into the wind, each step a struggle through drifts that swallowed his boots. The lantern's glow shrank to a feeble circle in the dark. Ice crusted his eyelashes, blurred his vision, but he pressed on, feeling a purpose he hadn't known since the day he buried his family. Every gust tore at him, every frozen gust driving needles through his coat. But the thought of that baby boy, small and defenseless in the hands of men who saw children as cargo, drove him forward. He would not fail her. He would not fail that child. By the time he reached the edge of Timber Creek, the lantern was burning low. The town was a cluster of buildings crouched against the wind, every window shuttered tight. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, pale threads against the storm. He passed the livery, the blacksmith shop, the clapboard church whose steeple vanished into the dark. Each place stood silent, as if the whole settlement was holding its breath. He made for the sheriff's office, a squat cabin with a lamp burning in the window. Inside, Deputy Thorne was bent over the stove, coaxing flame from damp kindling. He looked up, startled, as Silas stumbled through the door and dropped the lantern on the desk. Thorne was younger by a decade, lean and sharp-eyed, with the calm demeanor of a man who'd seen too much too early. He took in Silas's snow-caked coat and the grim set of his jaw. McCallum, he said slowly. "Didn't figure you'd be out tonight." Silas pulled off his gloves, voice rough from cold. "A woman's at my place. They attacked her wagon out by Black Ridge. Took her child, Mateo." He drew a long breath. "She says they're headed north, across the border." Thorne's eyes darkened. "Hale's men." He didn't ask if Silas was sure. The name was enough to tighten the air between them. Duncan Hale, freight magnate by daylight, trafficker by night, had been poisoning the territory for years. Everyone knew it, but no one had yet managed to pin him to a charge that would stick. Silas had heard the stories. Children vanishing from homesteads, wagons found empty save for blood. But hearing was not the same as seeing the aftermath. The terror in Isabella's eyes, the way her hands kept closing on air where her baby should have been. Thorne straightened, his face set. "I'll fetch the rifles. If we ride hard, we can catch them before the crossing." Silas nodded. He felt a stillness take hold of him. Not calm, exactly, but a hard, cold clarity. He had buried one child. He would not watch another be carried into the dark. They moved quickly, wordless, gathering supplies. Rifles, cartridges, blankets, a coil of rope. Thorne strapped a revolver to his hip and met Silas's gaze across the desk. "You understand," he said quietly. "This won't be just a recovery. If it's Hale's men, they'll fight to keep what they've stolen." Silas closed his hand around the stock of the Winchester. "Then let them try." Outside, the storm had not relented. Snow swept across the street in ragged sheets, plastering the horses' flanks as they were saddled. Thorne's gelding stamped and tossed its head, nostrils flaring white. Silas's mare, Delilah, stood steady as he tightened the cinch, her ears laid back but resolute. He paused a moment, resting his gloved hand against her neck, feeling the strength beneath the winter coat. He had raised her from a filly. She had carried him through worse than this, though he had never asked her to carry such stakes. When they mounted, the wind struck them full in the face, a wall of ice. Silas drew his collar high, lifted his gaze to the north. Somewhere beyond the frozen ridges, a baby boy cried for his mother. Somewhere, men laughed over stolen lives. He felt something deep inside him lock into place, a resolve that felt like iron in his chest. He looked once at Thorne. No words passed between them. None were needed. They turned their horses into the white, the town vanishing behind them, and rode into the teeth of the storm. The hours that followed blurred into a single unbroken trial of cold and darkness. Snow closed over their tracks as soon as they were made. The horses labored up narrow switchbacks where drifts rose to the saddle horns. At times the world shrank to the shapes of two animals, two men, and the lamp they carried, a frail golden bubble in an ocean of night. No one spoke. Breath froze on beards and lashes, and the wind stole whatever words might have risen. They rode by instinct, by the half-seen signs of passage, a broken branch, the ghost of wagon ruts beneath the fresh fall, a smear of blood on pale snow where someone had stumbled. The trail led higher, into the timbered slopes of the Crow's Foot Range, where the storm eased, but the cold grew deeper, sharpening to a blade. At last, near dawn, they came to the old McGreevy homestead. A cabin and barn left empty these 4 winters. The place crouched in a hollow among the pines, its roofline half buried in drifts. No smoke rose from the chimney, but Silas felt the prickle at the back of his neck that told him they were not alone. He dismounted in silence, hand falling to the rifle. Thorne gestured to the barn, where the snow was trampled down by many boots. Horse lines stretched into the darkness beyond the fence, black shapes shifting and stamping. Silas's breath clouded in front of him as he stepped closer. Through the warped boards of the barn wall, he saw lamplight flicker and a shadow cross. A tall man with a rifle slung careless over his shoulder. He drew back, heart thundering. This was no random band of thieves. This was organized, disciplined. And if Hale himself was here, then the stakes were higher than he'd feared. Thorne came up beside him, voice low. "We can't take them head on, too many." Silas looked past the barn to the cabin door, where the snow was churned by a child's smaller prints, and something tightened inside him. "We don't have to take them all, just long enough to get the boy." Thorne's jaw worked, but he nodded. "If we circle around the back, I can draw their fire. You go in." Silas met his eyes, reading the unspoken risk. A distraction would bring every gun to bear. Thorne might not walk away, but there was no other plan, no other chance. He clasped Thorn's shoulder, a gesture that said more than thanks. It was a promise between men who understood that certain things were worth any cost. They parted without another word. Silas skirted the edge of the yard, moving through the trees until he reached the far side of the cabin. He crouched behind a barrel, feeling the cold seep through his coat, and waited. The snow fell softer now, the storm tapering to silence. He could hear the wind in the pines, the creak of old wood, the distant breath of horses, and beneath it, the muffled wail of a child, thin, exhausted, the sound of a spirit nearly broken. His vision blurred. For a heartbeat he saw his own son, tiny and fevered in the cradle, the night before the fever took him. He closed his eyes and drew a slow breath. That loss had almost destroyed him. But tonight, some other father's grief might yet be spared. A single gunshot cracked the dawn, then another. Shouts erupted from the barn as Thorn fired again, the reports echoing through the hollow. Silas moved, rising into a crouch, sprinting for the back door. He hit it with his shoulder and felt the latch splinter. The door slammed inward. Inside, the air stank of kerosene, horse sweat, unwashed men. 3 startled faces turned to him, eyes wide. Before any could lift a weapon, he raised the Winchester and fired. The nearest dropped, his rifle clattering across the floor. Silas pivoted, heart thundering, and kicked aside a crate. There, huddled in a splintered cradle, was the boy. Dark curls matted to his feverish brow, cheeks flushed red with sickness and cold. Mateo. Silas slung the rifle, scooped the child up, and wrapped him in his coat. The boy whimpered, his small hand clutching Silas's collar as if he knew, even half-conscious, that this was the moment he might be saved or lost forever. Footsteps pounded in the passage beyond. Silas turned, the child tight in his arms, and prepared to fight his way out into the blinding dawn. The first man through the doorway never had a chance to shout. Silas swung the rifle up one-handed, fired, and felt the butt slam his shoulder. Smoke billowed in the cramped air. The man pitched forward, hitting the floorboards in a tangle of limbs. Behind him, another figure hesitated, then turned to flee. Silas backed toward the wall, heart hammering so loud he could barely hear Mateo's cries. He shifted the boy higher on his chest, feeling the heat radiating through the quilt. Fever was already tightening its hold. There would be no time to wait out the storm or hide in the hills. If the child did not see a healer before nightfall, the rescue would become a recovery. From the yard came the thunder of hooves and the crack of more gunfire. Thorn was holding the barn door, drawing fire away, but it wouldn't last. Silas crossed the room in 3 strides, both heels slamming the boards, and kicked open the side door. Snow-laden wind hit him in the face, half blinding him. He turned his back to it, shielding the boy. The mare was tethered to the fence, eyes rolling white. He ran to her, feeling the burn in his lungs, the high, thin panic of being too slow. Behind him, voices shouted. Orders barked over the gusts. He threw one arm over Mateo, the other fumbling at the saddle. Delilah danced sideways, nearly unseating him before he got 1 foot in the stirrup. Another shot cracked, spitting wood from the fence post inches from his leg. He didn't look back. He hauled himself up, clutching Mateo tight to his chest, and turned the mare in a tight arc. As he dug in his heels, she lunged forward, surging into the whiteness. For one mad instant, it felt like they were flying. Man and child and horse vaulting over the churned snow, over the ruin of all that barn had hidden. He pressed his chin to Mateo's hair, feeling how hot the boy's skin burned even in the wind. The fever was rising fast, the small body shivering against him. He prayed then, not in any language he had spoken in years, not to any god he thought still listening, but to whatever might grant this child the chance he'd been denied. Thorn rode out of the pines to meet him, his gelding lathered with sweat, eyes wild. Blood stained his coat at the shoulder, but he was upright, rifle still in hand. "Go!" he bellowed over the gale. "I'll hold them." Silas wanted to argue, to stay and end it here, but he looked down at Mateo, at the half-closed eyes, the tiny hand curled in the blanket. The choice was no choice at all. He nodded once, a promise to return, and drove Delilah down the trail. Snow whipped around them, rising in blinding sheets. The mare's hooves broke through the crust, plunging into hidden drifts. Every stride jolted through Silas's spine. The boy cried out, a hoarse, thready wail that cut him deeper than any bullet. He leaned low, whispering words he couldn't hear himself, words that meant, hold on, I'm here. By the time the ridge fell behind them, the storm was losing strength, the wind settling into a long, mournful sigh. The first color of dawn broke over the peaks, a smear of tarnished gold, and Silas saw the river valley spread below, timbered and hushed. Somewhere along that ribbon of ice lay the trail to Anaka White Feather. He had never trusted much in old remedies or the women who kept them, but desperation eroded the walls of pride. Anaka had birthed a generation in Timber Creek, healed fevers that killed stronger men than this child. If anyone could pull Mateo back from the edge, it was her. He felt the child's breathing falter, each exhale a tiny, fading whisper. His pulse surged in answer, a desperate rhythm of not yet, not yet. He urged Delilah into a canter, ignoring the ache in his shoulder, the raw burn in his throat. Around them the land was shifting, night giving way to a day none of them were promised. The snow still fell, but softer now, almost tender as it kissed the boy's fevered cheek. It felt like a benediction, or perhaps a warning that time was nearly spent. The track to Anaka White Feather's cabin was little more than a narrow cut through the pines, nearly lost under the night's fresh snow. Silas bent low over the saddle horn, guiding Delilah by memory and luck. Every time the mare stumbled, he felt the child's small body jolt against his chest. Mateo had grown silent, so quiet that for a moment Silas feared the last flicker of life had gone out. He pressed his hand to the boy's cheek, searching for any warmth. When he felt it, thin as a candle flame, he nearly wept. Hold on, he thought, his throat tight. We're almost there. At last he saw it, the low shape of the cabin tucked against a stand of birch trees, a wisp of smoke curling from the crooked chimney. Anaka's people had built it generations ago, when the valley was still unclaimed, when the land belonged only to those who knew its seasons and secrets. He had come here once, years back, with his wife burning up from childbed fever. He had not believed then. He had stood by the door with his hat crushed in his hands, thinking the old woman's chants and herbs were nothing but superstition. But his wife had woken, soaked in sweat and alive. And when she died years later, taken by another sickness, he had wondered if that first mercy had simply been a stay of sentence. Even so, he had never spoken ill of Anaka again. He slid from the saddle, knees buckling with exhaustion. Snow fell from his coat in heavy clumps as he stumbled to the door, one fist hammering the wood. "Anaka," he called, voice raw. "Please, open." The latch lifted almost at once, as though she had been standing there waiting. The woman who faced him was small and bent with age, hair a long silver braid over her shoulder. But her eyes were sharp as a hawk's, set deep in a face carved by wind and time. She looked at the bundle in his arms, then up at him, and something passed between them, an understanding too old for words. "Bring him," she said simply, stepping aside. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and dried herbs, of old earth, and something gentler he could not name. He laid Mateo on a pallet near the hearth, unwrapping the quilt with hands that shook. The child did not stir. Anaka knelt beside him, her thin fingers moving lightly over the boy's flushed face, feeling the heat that came off him in waves. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked up at Silas. "How long?" "Since the night," he rasped. "They took him. He was in the cold. I don't know how long." Her gaze did not soften. "He is between. You must be ready." "No," he said, voice hoarse. "I will not be ready. You saved my wife once. You can save him." She did not answer at first. Instead, she lifted a wooden bowl from the shelf, filled it with hot water, and sprinkled in pinches of crushed leaves, dried berries, powders he did not recognize. The steam rose, fragrant and bitter. She soaked a cloth and laid it across Mateo's brow, then took a slender willow branch and slipped it beneath the boy's tongue. Only then did she meet Silas's eyes. "I will try, but the child must decide to stay." He sank to his knees beside the pallet, feeling the warmth of the fire on his cheek. Mateo's small hand lay open on the blanket. Silas took it gently, folding those tiny fingers into his own. He thought of all the mornings he had woken alone, all the nights when grief had been the only thing he could feel. He thought of Isabella Vasquez, lying on his bench in the ranch house, whispering her son's name into the dark. and he knew that whatever price was asked of him, he would pay it. Annika began to murmur, her voice low and even, like the wind in the high branches. She set a bowl of water on the coals, filling the cabin with sharp cleansing heat. Silas did not understand the words, but he felt them settle into the marrow of the room, into his own heart, like a memory older than language. The boy shivered, a single small tremor that gave him hope. Stay, he thought fiercely. Stay with us. Let this be the night you live. The hours crawled past with the slow, merciless patience of winter. Silas did not move from the pallet, afraid that if he let go of Mateo's hand, the boy would slip from him like smoke. Outside, dawn kindled behind the birches, sending a wash of gold over the snow-laden branches. Annika moved around the small cabin in a quiet dance, adding more herbs to the steaming pot, pressing cool cloths to Mateo's flushed skin, laying her palm lightly on the small, heaving chest. The air grew thick with the pungent scent of cedar and wild mint. Each time Silas looked up, he found her watching him, as if measuring not only the boy's strength but his own. In that hush, memories rose, unbidden, sharp. He remembered the night his wife died, the way her breath rattled in the dark, and how he had held her hand long after it grew cold. He remembered a tiny white bundle lowered into the frozen earth behind the house. The priest had said grief would pass like any storm, but grief had not passed. It had merely grown quiet, sinking roots into every part of him. Until tonight, he had believed there was nothing left in him to give. Now, watching Mateo's chest rise and fall, he realized how wrong he had been. Some love was not a choice. It came like floodwater, unlooked for, unstoppable. The fever raged on, burning out whatever small reserves the child still possessed. As the morning hours stretched, Mateo's breathing grew shallow, the pauses between each ragged gasp lengthening. Silas pressed the boy's hand to his lips. "Don't," he whispered, voice breaking. "Don't you leave her. You fight, little man." He could not say Isabella's name aloud, not here, not with this old fear squeezing his heart. But he thought of her lying in his house, believing she had lost everything. He thought of the promise he had made. Annika set a hand on his shoulder. "He is crossing," she said gently. "It is time." "No." The word tore out of him raw. "No, he's not done. You said he must choose. Then let him hear me." She studied him in the flickering light, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once. "Speak." Silas swallowed hard. He leaned close, his mouth near the child's ear. "Mateo," he said, voice low and steady, though his hands trembled. "I know you can't hear me the way grown folks do, but somewhere inside you, you know your mama's voice. You know she's waiting. You come back to her, do you understand? You come back." He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to the small, fever-hot temple. The boy did not stir, but in the next breath a thin sigh left his lips. The hand in Silas's own twitched, the smallest flicker of life. Silas felt something unclench inside him, something he had carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. Hope, fragile as frost, but alive. Annika drew back to the hearth and began mixing a fresh poultice, her voice rising in the old language, an even chant that wrapped around them like a quilt. Outside, the first real light of day broke through the clouds. Silas watched as Mateo's flushed color began to pale, the fever retreating inch by inch. The boy's breathing steadied, slow, deep. When Annika pressed the back of her hand to his cheek, she nodded once. "He is coming back," she murmured. "You did well." Silas sat back on his heels, every muscle shuddering with exhaustion. He looked down at the small hand still caught in his own, and for the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't grief. It was fierce and bright and terrifying. It was love. A knock came at the door, tentative, uncertain. Annika crossed to open it. The wind gusted in, bringing a flurry of snow in the shape of a woman wrapped in a quilt. Isabella Vasquez stood in the threshold, her face bloodless, hair unbound around her shoulders. She looked at Silas, then past him to the pallet, and the breath left her in a broken sob. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees beside the boy, her hands searching his face, his hair, as if needing to be sure he was real. "Mateo," she whispered. "Mi corazón." Her tears fell on the child's cheek. And when his lashes fluttered open, just enough to see her, She pressed her mouth to his forehead and wept in earnest. Silas rose slowly, his legs unsteady. He turned away, giving them a moment that was theirs alone. The storm had broken. The morning was rising, and somewhere in the hush that followed, he felt the first thaw in a winter he'd thought eternal. They stayed in the cabin until midday, the storm spent and the sun breaking clear over the peaks. Matteo slept without fever, his small body slack with exhaustion but no longer in danger. Isabella had not left his side, her hand resting lightly over his heart, as if by sheer will she could keep it beating. Silas stood by the window, watching the world reappear inch by inch under the thawing light. He felt as though he were waking himself, from years of cold and silence into something raw and uncertain. When he turned to look at the woman and her son, he no longer saw strangers. He saw the fragile beginnings of something that might become a family. Anaka moved about her work with quiet purpose, packing herbs into waxed cloth, brewing one last infusion to ease the boy's recovery. When she finally straightened and met Silas's eyes, there was a gravity there that stilled him. "You must take them back to Timber Creek," she said. "Hale will not let this pass unanswered." He nodded. He had known it before he ever left the barn, that a man like Duncan Hale would not suffer humiliation. He would gather his hired guns and descend on the town, all the more dangerous for having been unmasked. Silas felt no fear in the thought, only a deep, bone-tired resolve. He looked at Isabella. "Can you ride?" She nodded, though her face was pale. "I will not leave him. Then we ride together." They wrapped Matteo in thick quilts, and Silas lifted him carefully to the saddle, cradled against Isabella's chest. Delilah walked beside Thorne's gelding, her steps sure even after the night's ordeal. Thorne met them halfway down the trail, blood seeping through the bandage on his shoulder but his expression grimly steady. When he saw the boy alive in Isabella's arms, something eased in his face. "You did it," he said softly. "By God, you did." Silas looked past him, down the valley where Timber Creek lay hidden beneath the pines. Not yet. The ride back was slow, every mile a test of endurance. They paused often to check the boy's breathing, to let Isabella rest her arms. Snow fell in thin, drifting veils that melted on their coats. Once, as they passed an old hunting cabin, Thorne raised a hand for silence. In the hush, they heard hoofbeats, faint but coming from the west trail. Hale's men were moving. Silas felt his jaw tighten. There would be no quiet end to this. When they reached the outskirts of town, they found the place braced for siege. Men with rifles crouched behind barrels and fence rails. The smith's apprentice, not yet 16, held a shotgun so long it nearly scraped the ground. Mrs. Larrabee, the seamstress, stood by the church door with a pistol tucked in her apron. Silas felt a strange pang of pride. Timber Creek was not much, just a scattering of buildings in a wilderness that forgot them every winter. But these people would not be taken easy. They dismounted near the sheriff's office. Thorne swung down and grunted as his wound pulled. "You get them inside," he said. "I'll see who's with us." Silas guided Isabella to the church clinic, a 2-room building that smelled of liniment and old prayers. The minister's wife came to take Matteo, settling him on a cot by the stove. Isabella knelt beside him, her hand still trembling. Silas laid a hand on her shoulder. "He'll be safe here." She looked up, her dark eyes luminous with fear and something stronger, something that steadied him. "Thank you," she whispered. He started to answer but found no words fit for what passed between them. He simply inclined his head and stepped outside. The street was filling with townsfolk, their faces pale but determined. Thorne emerged from the shadows, rifle slung ready. "Hale's riders are an hour out, maybe less." Silas scanned the line of rooftops, the makeshift barricades. He thought of the old life he'd built here, of all the nights he'd believed himself alone in the world. Now, with the wind easing into silence and the people of Timber Creek rallying to stand against a darkness older than any storm, he felt something like belonging. If this was to be their last stand, he would not face it as a ghost. He chambered around, feeling the familiar weight of the Winchester. Then he lifted his gaze to the western trail, where the first dark shapes were beginning to appear against the snow. The riders came at a measured pace, black silhouettes against the washed-out sky. There were perhaps 15 of them, each man wrapped in a long duster that snapped in the wind. At their head rode Duncan Hale, a broad-shouldered figure whose presence carried the cold authority of a man unaccustomed to fear. His horse was a rangy roan, iron-shod hooves striking sparks as they reached the edge of town. For a long moment, no one moved. Snow sifted down in lazy spirals, settling on hats and rifle barrels. Silas felt his heartbeat slow into a hard, steady drum. This was the reckoning he'd felt coming since the first moment Isabella had spoken her child's name. Hale raised a gloved hand and drew his mount to a halt. His face was pale as bleached bone, eyes hooded beneath the brim of his hat. He looked over the makeshift barricades, at the blacksmith's forge turned fortress, at the cluster of townspeople bracing behind overturned wagons, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a thin smile. When he spoke, his voice carried easily, smooth as river ice. "McCallum," he called as though they were neighbors greeting on a Sunday morning. "You have something that belongs to me." Silas stepped forward, rifle cradled in both hands. The snow whispered under his boots. "No," he said, his voice even. "I have someone, and he belongs to no man." Hale tilted his head, considering. "You think this ends here? A handful of farmers with borrowed guns? I've crossed 3 territories with this freight line. You know how many men have tried to stop me." His pale gaze swept the street. Everyone is in the ground. Silas felt the hush behind him, men and women holding their breath, waiting to see if he would yield. He thought of Isabella's face when she had looked down at her son alive. He thought of the promise he had made her in the storm, and he knew surrender was not an option. "Then you'd best get used to counting higher," he said softly. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Hale's mouth flattened. He lifted his hand, fingers curling. Silas felt the world tighten around that gesture, the moment before violence. And then the air split with the crack of a single rifle. Hale's hat flew from his head. He jerked back in the saddle, eyes wide with shock. A second shot rang out, and one of the riders pitched sideways into the snow, his duster blooming red. The town erupted in gunfire, the sound rolling off the false-fronted buildings in thunderous echoes. Silas dropped to one knee behind a water trough as splinters sprayed around him. He chambered around, aimed, fired. A rider toppled from his horse, boots dragging the stirrups. The animals screamed, rearing in panic as their riders fell. Smoke coiled into the freezing air. Shouts rose, ragged with fear and rage. Silas saw Thorne crouched behind the blacksmith's anvil, methodically working the lever of his rifle. The boy from the livery darted past, carrying fresh cartridges. Somewhere behind him he heard the minister's wife praying aloud, her voice steady as a church bell. He drew a breath, tasting powder and snow, and knew he was no longer the man who had hidden from the world behind grief. He was something harder now, something that could not be moved. Hale's men tried to break the line, spurring their horses through the barricade. Silas rose in their path, Winchester braced to his shoulder. The nearest rider brought up a revolver, but before he could fire, Silas squeezed the trigger. The impact lifted the man from the saddle. A second rider wheeled away, only to be struck by Thorne's bullet. In moments, the attack faltered. What had seemed an unstoppable force became a disordered retreat. Hale himself reined back, blood streaking his cheek from the graze of that first shot. His eyes met Silas's across the churned snow. For an instant, hatred flared, pure and bright as any flame. Then he turned his roan and spurred it hard, vanishing between the buildings in a spray of white. The last of his riders followed, leaving Timber Creek in stunned silence. Silas straightened, breath tearing in his chest. The street was littered with fallen men and dropped weapons. The snow stained black where it had drunk their blood. But the town still stood, and in that fragile, smoking hush, he felt something shift, a knowledge that this place, these people, had chosen to stand with him, chosen to fight for what was right. He turned, scanning the faces behind the barricades, and found not fear but something steadier, respect. It was late afternoon when the marshal's column reached Timber Creek, a line of riders emerging from the western ridge, their badges glinting in the pale sun. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and unhurried, blanketing the churned street as though to cover the blood and spent shells. Silas stood by the church steps, rifle resting in the crook of his arm, watching the lawmen pick their way between fallen bodies. The townsfolk drifted into the open, silent and watchful. It felt as though everyone was holding the same breath, waiting to see if this moment would end in reprisal or reprieve. The marshal dismounted slowly, a rangy, gray-bearded man whose eyes missed nothing. He glanced over the barricades, at the torn-up street, at Hale's men trussed against the fence like game. Then he looked at Silas. "You, McCallum?" His voice was low, unhurried. Silas nodded, the weariness settling into his bones at last. "Yes, sir." The marshal stepped closer, his gaze flicking to the church door. "I've got dispatches out of Fort Ellis saying you and Deputy Thorne led a posse to recover stolen children, that you brought them back alive." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "And that you held this town when Hale came to silence you." Silas swallowed. The weight of the past 24 hours pressed on him all at once. The ride through the blizzard, Mateo's fevered breaths, the gunfire in the dawn. He looked past the marshal's shoulder to where Isabella sat inside the church, her son curled in her arms, and felt a tired gratitude that they were still here to be accounted for. "That's true." For a moment the marshal said nothing. Then he nodded, once. "Good work." He turned and gestured to his deputies. "Round up the wounded. Leave Hale to me." It did not take long to find him. The freight magnate had hidden in the root cellar of an abandoned storeroom, huddled with 2 of his men. They brought him out in irons, blinking in the sudden daylight. His coat was torn, his face smeared with blood and filth. But when his gaze found Silas, a brittle contempt flared behind his pale eyes. As if even in defeat, he believed himself above all consequence. The marshal regarded him with a look of flat disgust. "Duncan Hale," he said evenly, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, trafficking, murder, and a dozen other counts that'll see you rot the rest of your days." He lifted a document, folded and stamped. "This warrant's federal. There'll be no bribes, no clever counsel to pry you loose." Hale did not reply. He stood silent as the deputies hauled him past the watching crowd, his boots leaving a crooked trail in the snow. Some part of Silas expected to feel triumphant as the man passed. A surge of vindication for all the lives stolen, all the mothers left grieving. But what rose instead was something quieter, a sober relief that it was finished, that this evil at least had found an ending. When the last of the prisoners had been loaded onto wagons, the marshal turned back to Silas. "We'll take their wounded to Fort Ellis for trial. The rest," he glanced at the townsfolk, at the broken barricades and the faces worn hollow by fear. "I expect you'll want to bury your dead." Silas inclined his head. "We will." As the lawman prepared to depart, Isabella stepped into the doorway behind him. Her hair was tied back, her face drawn but resolute. She looked at the wagons rolling away and then at Silas, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, neither moved. Then she crossed to his side. Mateo clung to her skirts, a small, solemn witness to the day's cost. The marshal paused at the threshold of the church. He studied the woman and the child, then Silas. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "If you need protection, the fort will send men." Silas shook his head. "No. I think we've got it handled." The older man considered that, then nodded once. "Godspeed to you." He swung up into the saddle, and the column turned west, their shadows long across the thawing snow. When the last rider vanished over the ridge, the town seemed to exhale. Doors opened. Voices rose, tentative at first, then stronger. A woman began to sweep the steps of the mercantile. Someone righted a barrel and set it back in place. Life, battered but stubborn, resumed its quiet claim. Silas looked down at Mateo, at Isabella's hand resting on the boy's shoulder, and felt the first stirrings of something he had not allowed himself in years. A future. He did not know its shape yet, but he knew it was waiting. They stayed in Timber Creek for the better part of a week, as the wounded were tended and the dead laid to rest. Each dawn, the church bell tolled, once for each life lost, and the townsfolk gathered in the snowbound yard, hats in hand, the hush broken only by prayer and the soft sobs of those left behind. Silas stood among them, feeling the weight of every name, every face, and the knowledge that none of it had been in vain. They had defended something worth saving, a place, a child, a chance. When the last grave was filled and the final hymn faded into the cold air, Isabella came to him by the livery. Her hair was braided neatly, her dark dress borrowed from Mrs. Larrabee. She looked tired, her eyes ringed in shadows. but there was a steadiness to her he had come to respect. She held Matteo close against her hip, and the boy watched Silas with solemn curiosity, as if studying a man he could not yet name. "We can't stay," she said quietly. "Not here. Every corner of this town remembers what happened." He nodded. "I know." She looked out over the street at the boarded windows and the black scars of bullet holes. "I have nothing left, Mr. McCallum. No family to write to. No money. No plan." She drew a slow breath. "But I won't let him grow up with this as his story." Silas studied her, the way she squared her shoulders though her hands trembled. In her voice, he heard a courage he envied. He thought of all the nights he had told himself he preferred his solitude, that he was safer alone, unbound to any heart but his own. But when he looked at Matteo, at the small hand fisted in the folds of Isabella's dress, he felt something shift. Perhaps life was not measured by how well a man kept his fences mended or his books balanced. Perhaps it was measured by what he was willing to risk his heart for. "You could come back to the ranch," he heard himself say. The words surprised him in their quiet certainty. "Until you find where you want to be." She turned to him then, searching his face as if weighing the shape of that offer. Snowflakes caught in her lashes, melting to small glistening trails. "And if we never find anywhere else?" He did not look away. "Then you stay." For a long moment she did not speak. The wind moved around them, tugging at the hem of her skirt. When she answered, her voice was softer. "I don't want charity." "It wouldn't be," he said. "It would be a start." Matteo stirred, reaching one hand toward Silas. He took it carefully, feeling the small strength there, the warm, living proof that not everything was doomed to be lost. He closed his fingers around the boy's and felt something ease in his chest. A part of him, quiet and wounded, recognized this as the beginning of something he would never have dared ask for. They left Timber Creek the next morning. A few neighbors gathered to see them off, offering small parcels of supplies and words of cautious blessing. Silas loaded the wagon with flour, beans, lamp oil, more provisions than he'd ever thought to need for himself alone. Isabella settled Matteo among the quilts, tucking a toy carved by the blacksmith's son into his hand. The boy clutched it close, watching the town slip away behind them, his dark eyes solemn but unafraid. As they climbed the ridge road, Silas glanced back once. The rooftops were already fading into the haze of fresh snowfall. For years he had believed that place was his only home. Now, with Isabella at his side, and the child resting between them, he wondered if home was less a matter of land and more the people who shared it. By midday, the ranch came into view, a low shape on the wide white plain. Smoke rose from the chimney. The fences he had mended and rebuilt year after year lay blanketed in snow, waiting for spring. He felt a pang of old sorrow, but it was softer now, its edges worn smooth by time, and by the simple fact that he was no longer returning to an empty house. When they stopped by the gate, Isabella reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold, but the touch steadied him. "We'll try," she said. It was not a promise of ease, but it was honest, and in that moment, he wanted nothing more. The days that followed unfolded with the quiet relentlessness of early thaw. Each morning Silas rose before dawn to tend the stock, breaking ice from the water troughs, checking the fence lines where drifts had receded. Isabella joined him sometimes, wrapped in her shawl, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with a fierce determination, how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to set a kettle to warm before the cold had fully surrendered the house. Matteo followed her everywhere, his small boots leaving a double trail in the wet snow behind hers. When Silas looked out across the yard and saw them together, he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. The work was the same as it had always been. Repairs, chores, the quiet business of keeping life going. But it felt different now, less like penance and more like purpose. In the evenings they gathered in the kitchen around the stove. Isabella mended clothing by lamplight, her needle flickering silver. Matteo dozed against her side, clutching the wooden horse the blacksmith's boy had given him. Silas sometimes read aloud from the old Bible he'd inherited, though his voice was rusty with disuse. Even if the words were half forgotten, the comfort of them filled the silence between the walls. Sometimes, after the boy was asleep, they talked in low voices about what came next. Isabella confessed that she did not know how long she meant to stay. Silas admitted he did not know how to ask her to stay, without sounding like a man too starved for company to think straight. So instead, they spoke of small things, whether to plant corn in the upper field when the lambing would start, how many jars of preserves the pantry could hold. In those simple conversations, the shape of a shared life began to grow, unhurried and undeniable. One night, as a late snow drifted past the window, Isabella closed her mending and looked across the table at him. "I used to believe I was strong," she said quietly, "but I didn't know what strength was until I had to keep living after they took him." She smoothed her palm over Mateo's hair, her gaze far away. "When you found me, I was ready to lie down in that snow and let it end. If you hadn't come—" Her voice trailed off, but he heard all the words she did not say. He set his hands flat on the table. The lamplight caught the scars on his knuckles, the history of every loss and every fight that had led him here. "I think strength is just getting up again, even when you don't want to." She studied him for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his own loneliness, tempered now by something steadier. Not pity, he would not have borne that, but understanding, recognition. Slowly, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Her touch was warm despite the cold that still clung to the world outside. For a long moment, neither spoke. They did not need to. By March, the snow began to recede in earnest. Brown earth showed in patches along the fence line. The creek behind the barn, frozen solid since December, cracked and rumbled as the first water fought its way free. Mateo grew stronger every day. He followed Silas out to the corrals, his small hands grasping the rails as he watched the cattle with solemn fascination. Sometimes he would look up with that same questioning gaze, dark eyes that seemed too old for so small a boy, and Silas felt something catch in his throat. He did not know yet what he was to this child, but he knew he would never let him be stolen again. One morning, Isabella came out to where he was mending a broken hinge on the gate. Her shawl fluttered in the warming breeze, and she looked younger in the pale spring light. "The snow's almost gone," she said, her voice steady. "I suppose I ought to start thinking about what comes next." He set down his hammer, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You don't have to decide yet." She smiled, a small hesitant thing that made something bright stir behind his ribs. "I know." She looked past him to where Mateo was chasing the first brave chickens from their coop. "But I think, maybe, we're already there." Silas followed her gaze, the early sun catching in Mateo's hair like a promise. He felt the old sorrow stir inside him, still present, still a part of who he was, but it no longer defined the shape of his days. Something new was taking root, and for the first time in years, he did not dread what might grow. Spring came in slow degrees, the snow surrendering by inches to the stubborn green beneath. The land seemed awake all at once, cottonwoods shaking out new leaves, creek water running clear over the stones, meadowlarks stitching bright notes into the dawn. Silas felt the thaw inside himself as keenly as he felt it in the earth. There were mornings now when he woke before the sun, and the first thing he felt wasn't dread. It was a curious, tentative hope that the day might bring something worth keeping. He and Isabella found a rhythm that neither had spoken aloud, but both understood. In the early hours, she worked beside him in the yard, feeding the chickens, fetching water, coaxing the limp winter cabbages back to life. Sometimes they spoke, often they didn't. But the silence between them no longer felt like absence. It was more like a held breath, a space where something new might grow. When the chores were done, she would sit with Mateo on the porch, teaching him the names of things. Sky, leaf, fence, fire. Her voice, low and patient, threaded through the quiet in a way that made the house feel less hollow. One afternoon, when the sun had finally grown warm enough to soften the last drifts, Silas came back from the north pasture to find her kneeling by the raised beds behind the kitchen. She was turning the soil with her bare hands, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. For a moment he stood watching her, the simple grace of that movement. A woman tending a garden in a place that had known too much loss. Struck him then how rare it was to see her unguarded, to witness her reclaiming something as ordinary as planting seed. She looked up, brushing a stray curl from her cheek, and caught him staring. A flush rose in her face, but she didn't look away. "You ever try to grow tomatoes out here?" she asked, as though the question were nothing, as though it cost her nothing to pretend they were just two people making a life. He hooked his thumbs in his belt. I tried once. The frost took him. He hesitated, then added, "But you could try again." Her smile was shy, almost surprised. "I think I will." After supper that night, when Matteo had fallen asleep in the big chair by the stove, Isabella lingered at the table. Silas was wiping down the last of the dishes, and she watched him with that thoughtful, searching look he was coming to expect. "I need to tell you something," she said at last. He set the towel aside. "All right." She folded her hands in her lap. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid it would sound like I was asking too much." She drew a breath. "But Matteo needs stability, a place where he doesn't have to wonder if he'll be moved on again." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "And I need it too." Silas felt something lodge behind his ribs. "You're not asking too much." She looked down, the candlelight tracing the delicate bones of her face. "I don't know what you'd call this. Us. I'm not expecting promises, but I want you to know that if you'll have us, we'd stay." He came around the table then, slow and careful, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace they'd built. He rested his hand over hers. Her skin was warm and dry, her fingers strong in his. "I'd have you," he said simply. "Both of you." Her eyes filled, but she did not look away, and in the quiet that followed, Silas felt the last of the old loneliness begin to recede. He had spent so many years believing that grief was the only testament to love he'd ever carry. But here, in this small kitchen lit by one flickering lamp, he understood that love was not only what was lost, it was also what could be found again, in the plain hours of an ordinary day. That night, after he banked the stove and carried Matteo to bed, he paused at the doorway to the spare room. Isabella was sitting on the edge of the cot, smoothing the quilt around her son. She looked up, her expression unguarded, and for the first time he saw not just sorrow in her face, but peace. It was enough, more than enough. The weeks lengthened into the soft season between spring and high summer. The days warmed, the wind gentled, and the land laid down its memory of ice. The ranch yard turned green in patches where grass forced its way through the mud, tender as new promises. Silas mended the last of the winter-broken fence rails. Isabella planted her tomatoes in the raised beds behind the kitchen, neat rows that made her smile whenever she walked past. Matteo grew sturdy in the sun, his small hands perpetually smudged with dirt, his dark eyes bright and unafraid. Some evenings, when the chores were finished and the light slanted golden through the cottonwoods, they sat together on the porch. Matteo would fall asleep first, curled under the old quilt that had covered Silas's own son once, before the world had taught him how easily everything could be lost. It was the hardest thing, and the simplest, to lay that same quilt over another child, and believe that this time might end differently. But each time he watched Matteo breathe, steady, strong, he felt a little more of the old doubt loosen its hold. Isabella would sit close beside him, her hand sometimes brushing his on the railing. They spoke in low voices about small things, when to bring the calves in, whether the roof would hold another winter, if the orchard might yield a few baskets come September. But beneath those everyday questions was something deeper, a quiet agreement that they were no longer just passing through each other's lives. They were building something, row by row, day by day. One night, as dusk pooled like ink along the fence rows, Silas found the courage to say what had been gathering in him, like the slow rise of thaw water. "I used to think," he began, voice low, "that grief was the price for any happiness worth having, that if you loved something enough to miss it when it was gone, you were doomed to carry that ache forever." She turned toward him, her face lit by the last thin spill of daylight. "And now?" He searched her eyes, feeling how the words steadied him even as they threatened to break him. "Now I think maybe grief is only proof that you lived, that you were here, that you loved as much as you could. But it doesn't mean you have to stay there. It doesn't mean you can't love again." She did not look away. A tear slid down her cheek, and she let it fall. "I think you're right." For a while, neither of them spoke. The breeze shifted, carrying the scent of new grass and the last trace of snowmelt. Matteo stirred in his sleep, sighing as if content to dream in this place that had become home. Silas reached across the narrow space and took Isabella's hand. She closed her fingers around his, her grip certain. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise spoken out loud, but it was enough. As darkness gathered, he felt the land settle into its night quiet. The wind softened to a hush, like breath on the nape of his neck. Somewhere out in the pasture, a calf bawled for its mother. He listened to that plaintive call and thought how the world kept making new beginnings, whether a man believed he deserved them or not. In the morning, there would be chores and the slow, patient work of mending what winter had broken. There would be tomatoes to tend, fences to rebuild, a child to guide. And in all of it, there would be this fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, they had come through the worst, that the thaw was not only in the earth but in their hearts. He looked at Isabella, her face turned toward the stars just beginning to appear. In that moment she looked younger than he'd ever seen her, as though the years of sorrow had lifted a little. He knew they would never forget what had been lost, but he also knew it no longer had to define them. Spring had come at last. The snow was gone, the fences stood repaired, and the house that had once echoed with emptiness now held laughter, quiet voices, and the soft weight of belonging. And in that final hush before night claimed the valley, Silas McCallum felt certain of only this: love was not the end of sorrow, but the way through it. And this time he would not turn away.